January 14, 1942. Santa Isabel, Fernando Po, Spanish Guinea. The humid equatorial night clung to the harbour like a suffocating blanket, thick with the mingled scents of diesel fuel, rotting timber, and tropical decay. In the black waters of this forgotten colonial port, 3 vessels rode at anchor, silent monuments to Axis confidence in neutral waters. The German cargo ship Licomba, her hull scarred by months of Atlantic crossings. The Italian passenger liner Duchessa d'Aosta, elegant even in wartime neglect. The German tug Bussing, compact but powerful, her diesel engines cold in the stifling heat. From the shadows of a weathered Spanish fishing vessel, 6 men watched through the darkness. Their faces were darkened with cork ash, their hands steady despite the magnitude of what they contemplated. Major Gus March Phillips adjusted his watch. 00:30 hours. In 60 minutes, these men would attempt something that violated every convention of warfare, diplomacy, and maritime law. They would steal 3 enemy ships from under the noses of Spanish colonial authorities without firing a shot, without leaving witnesses, without official sanction from any government that could acknowledge their existence. The air was so still that the slap of wavelets against hull plate carried across the harbour like whispered warnings. Somewhere in the colonial quarters above the port, Spanish officers slept peacefully, confident in their neutrality. In the anchorage, German and Italian crews dozed in their quarters, equally confident in international law. None suspected that 6 British commandos were about to rewrite the rules of covert warfare in a single night of audacious seamanship. March Phillips raised his hand. The operation that would become known as Postmaster, the most improbable naval heist of World War II, was about to begin. In the colonial clubs of Santa Isabel, German merchant officers had spent weeks sharing the same joke over warm Spanish beer. The British, Capitan Heinrich Daimel of the Licomba, would chuckle, gesturing toward the harbour with his glass. Here, in Spanish waters, the very suggestion provoked genuine mirth among the Axis expatriate community. They wouldn't dare risk a diplomatic incident for 3 cargo vessels. The Italian officers of the Duchessa d'Aosta were equally dismissive, their confidence bordering on contempt. Captain Giuseppe Volta had publicly declared that the Royal Navy might control the Atlantic approaches, but Fernando Po remained inviolate, protected not by guns or armour, but by something far more powerful: international law. Let them try, he had boasted at the Club Espagnol just days earlier. Spain will protest to London, and Churchill himself will have to apologise. The German wireless operator aboard the Bussing regularly intercepted British naval communications, reporting increased Royal Navy activity off the West African coast. But these intercepts only reinforced their sense of security. The British were clearly frustrated, prowling the shipping lanes like hungry wolves, while their prey sheltered safely in neutral ports. They circle and they wait, radioed Oberleutnant Klaus Weber to Hamburg. But they cannot touch us here. Even the Spanish colonial authorities shared this complacent certainty. Governor Juan Fontan Lobé had personally assured the Axis captain that Fernando Po's neutrality was absolute, protected by centuries of maritime tradition and the full diplomatic weight of the Franco government. The harbour patrol consisted of a single gunboat, the Cabo Fradera, whose ancient engines rarely functioned and whose crew treated their duties as ceremonial rather than tactical. What none of these men understood was that across 4,000 miles of ocean, in the basement offices of 64 Baker Street, London, a different kind of war was being planned. The Special Operations Executive had been created precisely to ignore the diplomatic niceties that protected ships like the Licomba. Their mandate was simple: set Europe ablaze. If that required violating Spanish neutrality, stealing German ships, and turning international law into a paper tiger, so be it. Dr. Hugh Dalton, Minister of Economic Warfare, had personally signed the authorization for Operation Postmaster after reading intelligence reports about the strategic value of 3 vessels. The Licomba carried critical spare parts for U-boat. The Duchessa d'Aosta housed a sophisticated wireless station that coordinated Axis merchant shipping across the South Atlantic. The Bussing possessed the most powerful tugboat engines in the region, capable of assisting damaged warships to reach safe harbor. But beyond their immediate tactical value, these ships represented something more dangerous, proof that neutral ports could provide perfect sanctuary for Axis operations. If Germany and Italy could operate freely from Fernando Po, every Spanish and Portuguese colony would become a potential base for commerce raiders and supply vessels. The precedent had to be shattered. The laughter in Santa Isabel's colonial clubs was about to die in the throats of very surprised men. The genesis of Operation Postmaster lay in the intersection of desperation and innovation that characterized British special operations in 1942. With the German U-boat offensive strangling Atlantic convoys and Rommel advancing across North Africa, Churchill's war cabinet demanded unconventional solutions to conventional problems. The newly formed Special Operations Executive represented Britain's commitment to fighting what Hugh Dalton called ungentlemanly warfare, operations that existed in the grey spaces between diplomacy and open combat. Major Augustus Charles Newman, March Phillips, embodied this new breed of warrior. A veteran of the Royal Artillery who had transferred to the Special Forces after Dunkirk, March Phillips possessed the rare combination of tactical brilliance and operational audacity that SOE required. His small-scale raiding force had already conducted successful operations along the French coast, but Operation Postmaster would test both his planning skills and his ability to command in the ultimate high-stakes environment. The technical challenges were staggering. Fernando Po lay 800 miles south of the main British naval base at Freetown, Sierra Leone. Any operation would require crossing Spanish territorial waters, penetrating a defended harbour, and conducting complex maritime manoeuvres under cover of absolute darkness. The 3 target vessels were moored in the centre of Santa Isabel's anchorage, surrounded by Spanish patrol boats and under the nominal protection of shore-based artillery. March Phillips's solution was characteristically unconventional. Rather than attempting a direct military assault, he proposed conducting the operation under commercial cover, using a requisitioned Spanish merchant vessel, the Vulcan. The ship's papers identified her as engaged in legitimate trade between British and Spanish colonies, a perfectly normal transaction that would arouse no suspicion from harbour authorities. The Vulcan herself was a masterpiece of covert engineering. Built in Glasgow in 1938 as a standard cargo carrier, she had been extensively modified by the Admiralty's secret shipyards at Portsmouth. Her holds contained not trade goods, but specialised naval equipment, magnetic limpet mines, underwater cutting charges, portable radio jammers, and enough small arms to outfit a reinforced company. Her engines had been tuned for silent running, with baffled exhaust systems that reduced acoustic signatures to near-whisper levels. Most critically, her crew represented a carefully selected fusion of British naval expertise and local knowledge. March Phillips had recruited Nigerian boatmen who understood West African tides and currents, Spanish-speaking wireless operators who could impersonate local harbour officials, and Royal Navy divers trained in underwater demolition. Every man aboard the Vulcan possessed multiple skills and absolute discretion. Failure would mean not just death, but diplomatic catastrophe for Britain. The operational timeline reflected meticulous attention to detail. Intelligence reports indicated that Spanish harbour patrols followed predictable patterns, with guard changes at midnight and dawn. The target vessels maintained skeleton crews during port visits, with most officers ashore enjoying the limited pleasures of colonial society. Weather reports promised overcast skies and minimal moonlight, perfect conditions for clandestine maritime operations. Yet for all the careful planning, Operation Postmaster remained fundamentally an improvisation, dependent on factors beyond British control: Spanish negligence, German overconfidence, and the kind of operational luck that separates successful raids from catastrophic failure. March Phillips understood that no plan, however detailed, could account for the human element that would ultimately determine success or failure. As the Vulcan cleared Freetown Harbour on January 11, 1942, her captain carried sealed orders that officially denied her existence. If captured, her crew would be disavowed by the British government and abandoned to whatever justice Spanish or German authorities might provide. They sailed not as uniformed soldiers, but as deniable assets in Britain's shadow war, men whose success would be celebrated in secret and whose failure would never be acknowledged. The machinery of impossible plans was about to collide with the reality of human courage under fire. At precisely 0:30 hours on January 15, 1942, the first phase of Operation Postmaster began to unravel with the kind of mundane crisis that destroys carefully laid plans. Seaman Richards, assigned to cut the anchor chains of the Duchessa d'Aosta, discovered that his underwater cutting torch had failed to ignite properly in the humid tropical air. The flame sputtered and died, leaving him treading water beside 20 tons of Italian steel with nothing but a hand file and 60 minutes to complete an impossible task. March Phillips, monitoring the operation from the bridge of the Vulcan, faced the commander's ultimate nightmare. Success depended on precise timing, but reality refused to cooperate with precision. Radio discipline demanded absolute silence, so he could not call for backup equipment or revised orders. The mission would succeed or fail based on individual initiative and improvised solutions to unforeseen problems. The Spanish harbor patrol boat Cabo Fradera chose that precise moment to conduct an unscheduled inspection of the anchorage, her searchlights sweeping across the black water in lazy arc. From his position near the German tug Bussing, Lieutenant Graham Hayes watched the beam approach his hiding position and calculated the odds of remaining undetected. The mathematics were unforgiving. Discovery meant capture, capture meant interrogation, and interrogation meant the exposure of SOE operations across West Africa. But the real crisis emerged from an entirely unexpected source. The Italian wireless operator aboard the Duchessa d'Aosta, unable to sleep in the oppressive heat, had decided to conduct routine maintenance on his radio equipment. His test transmissions, broadcast on standard merchant marine frequencies, threatened to alert every vessel in the harbour to unusual nocturnal activity. If German or Spanish operators detected the unauthorized signals, they would investigate the source and find British commandos cutting their anchor chain. The situation demanded split-second decision-making under impossible pressure. Hayes, still concealed beneath the Bussing's hull, made the choice that would define the entire operation. Rather than aborting his mission, he began cutting through the tug's massive anchor chain with nothing but a hand-operated hacksaw, each stroke producing sparks that threatened to illuminate his position. The work was agonizingly slow and desperately dangerous, but retreat would abandon the operation's primary objective. Simultaneously, Richard solved his technical crisis through pure improvisation. Unable to ignite his cutting torch, he attached explosive charges directly to the Duchessa d'Aosta's anchor chain, calculating fuse lengths by counting his own heartbeats. The charges would detonate in sequence, but their timing depended on estimates rather than precise engineering. Too fast, and the explosions would alert the entire harbour. Too slow, and the operation would fail when dawn broke over the anchorage. The Spanish patrol boat continued its leisurely circuit, its crew apparently oblivious to the drama unfolding beneath their spotlight. But appearances deceived. Cabo Fradera's captain, Lieutenant Jorge Ramirez, had noticed unusual patterns in the harbour's ambient noise. Engines that should have been silent seemed to be running at idle speed. Anchor chains that should have been stationary appeared to be under tension. His decades of maritime experience warned him that something was wrong, even if he could not identify the specific threat. March Phillips watched these converging crises through binoculars, calculating odds and alternatives with the cold precision that defined special operations leadership. The mission was balanced on a knife's edge. Success required perfect execution of imperfect plans, while failure would expose Britain's most sensitive covert operations to international scrutiny. Every decision carried consequences that extended far beyond Fernando Po's humid harbour. The night that had begun with confident certainty was about to become a masterclass in operational improvisation under fire. At 01:47 hours, Lieutenant Graham Hayes heard the sound that would haunt his nightmares for decades afterward, the deep, resonant snap of the Bussing's anchor chain parting under the accumulated stress of his careful cutting. The massive links, each weighing 40 pounds, crashed into the harbour bottom with a noise that seemed to echo across all of Spanish Guinea. For 10 eternal seconds, absolute silence followed the impact, the kind of silence that precedes either salvation or catastrophe. Then, the Duchessa d'Aosta's explosive charges detonated in perfect sequence, their muffled thunder rolling across the water like distant artillery. The Italian liner lurched forward as her anchor chain parted, her hull grinding against the dock pilings with a screech of tortured metal that raised every German and Spanish head in the colonial quarter. Emergency lights flickered on across the harbour as duty officers stumbled from their quarters, trying to comprehend what sounded like a naval battle in their peaceful anchorage. But March Phillips had anticipated this moment of maximum danger, and his response transformed chaos into opportunity. As alarms began sounding throughout Santa Isabel, the Vulcan's hidden radio equipment began broadcasting a carefully prepared deception on Spanish naval frequencies. The transmission, delivered in perfect Castilian Spanish by a Gibraltarian operator, reported a routine anchor-dragging exercise, authorized by the harbour master and conducted by visiting British merchant vessels. The brilliance of the deception lay in its bureaucratic plausibility. Spanish colonial officials, awakened in the middle of the night and confused by contradictory reports, found themselves presented with apparently official documentation for an exercise they had never authorized but could not definitively deny. The transmission included proper authentication code obtained through SOE intelligence operations and referenced specific harbour regulations that few Spanish officers had bothered to memorize. Captain Volta of the Duchessa d'Aosta emerged from his cabin to discover his ship moving slowly through the anchorage under tow by an unknown vessel. His first reaction was indignation rather than alarm. Clearly, some Spanish tugboat captain had confused his vessel with another ship scheduled for repositioning. He ordered his wireless operator to contact the harbormaster and demand an explanation for this unauthorized maneuver. The wireless operator's response changed indignation to growing concern. "Capitano, there is no response from the harbormaster, and our anchor chain, it has been cut." The implications struck Volta like physical blows. Professional tugboat crews did not accidentally cut anchor chains while repositioning vessels. The precise explosions, the coordinated timing, the mysterious towing vessel that maintained radio silence, these were not symptoms of bureaucratic confusion, but evidence of deliberate action. Aboard the German cargo ship Likomba, Captain Heinrich Demel reached the same terrifying conclusion through different evidence. His chief engineer reported that unknown personnel had boarded the ship and disabled her engines without triggering any security alarm. The work showed professional expertise, exactly the kind of technical knowledge possessed by naval saboteurs. But who would conduct such operations in Spanish waters, and why target merchant vessels rather than warships? The answer came when Demel spotted the darkened silhouette of the Vulcan through his binoculars. The vessel's lines were familiar. He had seen identical ships in German intelligence photographs of British auxiliary cruisers, but those ships operated openly as naval vessels, flying Royal Navy ensigns and operating under Admiralty orders. This vessel flew no flags and answered no radio challenges, moving through Spanish territorial waters like a ghost ship from maritime legend. The realization that struck all three Axis captains simultaneously was as humbling as it was terrifying. They were not experiencing mechanical failure or bureaucratic confusion, but witnessing the execution of a perfectly planned military operation. The British had not simply violated Spanish neutrality, they had transformed it into a weapon against German and Italian interests. The laughter in Santa Isabel's colonial clubs had become the prelude to professional humiliation on an unprecedented scale. March Phillips allowed himself a thin smile as the three prizes began moving toward open water. The transformation was complete. Arrogance had become uncertainty, certainty had become chaos, and neutral sanctuary had become a hunting ground for British special operations. The night belonged to Audacity, and Audacity belonged to Britain. By 0230 hours, Operation Postmaster had evolved into a maritime ballet of extraordinary complexity and precision. The three captured vessels moved through Fernando Po's harbour in perfect formation, their engines silent, but their momentum maintained by the Vulcan's carefully calculated towing array. Each ship presented unique challenges that demanded real-time solutions from March Phillips's carefully selected crew. The Italian liner Duchessa d'Aosta, largest of the three prizes, proved most difficult to control in the harbour's confined waters. Her deep draft and high superstructure made her vulnerable to the harbour's cross-currents, while her size threatened to attract attention from Spanish shore batteries if her movement appeared suspicious. Lieutenant Commander Leonard Guise, the Royal Navy's most experienced salvage officer, had volunteered for the operation specifically to handle such complications. Working from the liner's bridge with a Spanish-speaking signalman, he maintained radio contact with harbour authorities while skillfully disguising the ship's unauthorized departure as routine harbour traffic. The German cargo vessel Likomba presented different but equally challenging problems. Her holds contained not only spare parts for U-boat operations, but also classified technical documentation that German intelligence considered invaluable. Captain Geoffrey Appleyard, March Phillips's second-in-command, led a small boarding party that had to secure these materials, while simultaneously ensuring the ship remained under British control. The work required both combat expertise and technical knowledge, skills that few officers possessed in combination. Most critically, the German tug Bussing had to be operational rather than merely captured. Her powerful engines and sophisticated navigation equipment would be essential for towing damaged Allied vessels in future operations. Chief Petty Officer Tom Winter, a peacetime tugboat captain from Portsmouth, spent the crucial early hours of the operation learning the Bussing's German-designed control systems while simultaneously ensuring her crew remained secure and silent. The psychological dimensions of the operation proved as complex as its technical challenges. Each captured vessel contained crew members who represented potential intelligence sources, diplomatic complications, and immediate security threats. The German and Italian officers possessed detailed knowledge of Axis shipping operations, convoy schedules, and naval codes. But extracting this information required interrogation techniques that transcended simple military questioning. Major March Phillips had prepared for this contingency by recruiting personnel with unusual combinations of skills. Captain Marcus Czech, a Foreign Office diplomat with fluent German and Italian, conducted impromptu interrogations while posing as a neutral Swiss observer documenting Spanish colonial administration. His approach was subtle but effective. Rather than demanding military information, he encouraged captured officers to explain their presence in Fernando Po and their future operational plans. The Germans and Italians, still uncertain about their captor's identity and objectives, provided surprisingly detailed responses to what seemed like bureaucratic inquiry. The Spanish authorities presented the operation's most delicate challenge. Governor Juan Fontan-Lobe could not be allowed to realize the true nature of the night's events, but he also could not be left completely ignorant of apparent harbor irregularities. The solution required a masterpiece of diplomatic deception that tested every aspect of SOE's planning capabilities. At 03:15 hours, the Spanish harbour master received a radio transmission from an apparently British merchant captain requesting permission to escort 3 vessels to deeper water for emergency engine maintenance. The transmission included proper authentication code and referenced legitimate shipping schedule, but its timing and circumstances raised inevitable questions. The harbour master's response would determine whether Operation Postmaster concluded successfully or collapsed into diplomatic catastrophe. The Spanish official's reply revealed both the strengths and limitations of neutral bureaucracy in wartime conditions. Proceed with caution. Report position at dawn. The response suggested suspicion, tempered by institutional reluctance to challenge apparently legitimate maritime operations. Spanish neutrality depended on avoiding confrontations that might force uncomfortable choices between competing belligerents. As the small convoy cleared Fernando Po's harbour entrance and entered the open Atlantic, March Phillips allowed himself to consider the broader implications of the night's success. 3 enemy vessels had been captured without casualty, without diplomatic incidents, and without alerting Axis intelligence to SOE operational capabilities. The precedent established by Operation Postmaster would reshape covert warfare for the remainder of World War II, but the ultimate test lay ahead. Reaching British territorial waters with 3 captured prizes while avoiding U-boat patrols, surface raiders, and the inevitable pursuit by Spanish and German naval forces. The night's work was complete, but the operation's success remained balanced on the knife's edge of operational execution under fire. The symphony of silent thunder was about to reach its crescendo. Dawn broke over the South Atlantic on January 15, 1942, with the kind of crystalline clarity that reveals both triumph and tragedy with equal precision. The horizon stretched empty in all directions, broken only by the distinctive silhouettes of 4 vessels moving in perfect formation toward distant Freetown. The British flag flew from the Vulcan's masthead, while the 3 captured prizes followed in her wake, like trophies of war made manifest. Aboard the Duchessa d'Aosta, Captain Giuseppe Volta faced the crushing realization that his months of confident boasting had been transformed into professional humiliation of unprecedented scope. The Italian officer, who had publicly declared Fernando Po inviolate, now found himself a prisoner aboard his own ship, watching British naval personnel operate his vessel with casual competence. The irony was as bitter as it was complete. The same international law he had trusted to protect him now prevented any rescue attempt that might violate British territorial waters. The German response to Operation Postmaster's success revealed the psychological impact of impossible operations on conventional military thinking. Capitan Heinrich Daimel of the Licomba, interrogated by Captain Marcus Czech during the voyage to Freetown, expressed bewilderment rather than anger at his capture. "This is not warfare," he protested. "This is piracy." But Czech's response cut to the heart of Britain's strategic transformation. "War is what we make it, Herr Captain. Your Führer changed the rules. We simply learned to play by them." The intelligence harvest from Operation Postmaster exceeded even SOE's optimistic projections. The Duchessa d'Aosta's wireless station contained complete Axis merchant shipping codes for the South Atlantic, enabling British naval intelligence to track every German and Italian vessel operating between West Africa and South America. The Licomba's cargo included critical spare parts for U-boat operations, whose absence would force German submarines to return to European ports for maintenance they could have received at sea. Most significantly, the operation's psychological impact rippled through Axis naval operations worldwide. If 3 ships could disappear from Spanish territorial waters without trace or explanation, no neutral port offered genuine security from British special operations. The precedent established by Operation Postmaster forced Germany and Italy to maintain expensive defensive patrols in every supposedly safe harbour from Norway to the Mediterranean. The Spanish government's response to the night's events revealed the diplomatic complexities that surrounded all covert operations in wartime conditions. Governor Juan Fontán-Lobé filed an official protest with the British consul in Santa Isabel, demanding explanation for the apparent violation of Spanish neutrality. But the protest's language reflected careful ambiguity rather than genuine outrage. Spain could not admit that Axis vessels had been operating freely from Fernando Po without acknowledging violations of its own neutrality. British diplomatic response proved equally nuanced and infinitely more cynical. The Foreign Office denied any knowledge of unauthorized military operations in Spanish waters, while simultaneously expressing concern about apparent German and Italian violations of Spanish neutrality in Fernando Po. The response transformed Spain's complaint into an admission of its own failure to maintain genuine neutrality, effectively ending any possibility of meaningful diplomatic consequences. The operational lessons learned from Postmaster would influence British special operations throughout World War II and beyond. March Phillips had demonstrated that audacity combined with meticulous planning could achieve results that conventional military operations could not match. The success validated Churchill's investment in ungentlemanly warfare and provided a template for operations from Norway to Southeast Asia. But the operation's human cost remained hidden beneath its strategic success. 3 days after reaching Freetown, Major Gus March Phillips received orders for another SOE mission, an assault on German positions in occupied France that would end with his death in September 1942. The man who had orchestrated the perfect theft would not survive to see how completely Operation Postmaster had changed the nature of covert warfare. The German and Italian officers captured during the operation spent the remainder of World War II in British prisoner-of-war camps. Their detailed knowledge of Axis naval operations extracted through patient interrogation. Their ships were commissioned into Royal Navy service under new names, their German and Italian identities erased as completely as their former loyalties. In the harbour of Santa Isabel, Spanish authorities erected a small plaque commemorating the night when 3 foreign vessels mysteriously disappeared from Fernando Po's anchorage. The plaque's inscription, composed in careful diplomatic language, referred to an incident of unclear origin during wartime conditions. Local fishermen, when asked about the events of January 15th, claimed to remember nothing unusual, a collective amnesia that suggested either official pressure or genuine uncertainty about what they had witnessed. The reckoning of arrogance had concluded with the kind of surgical precision that defines successful special operations, maximum strategic impact achieved through minimal tactical exposure. Operation Postmaster had proven that in total war, neutrality was merely another battlefield where victory belonged to those willing to rewrite the rules of engagement. The captured vessels of Operation Postmaster sailed into Freetown Harbour on January 18, 1942, to a reception that balanced celebration with calculated secrecy. Royal Navy personnel lined the quays, but their cheers remained muted by operational security requirements that would keep the mission classified for decades. The 3 prizes, Duchessa d'Aosta, Licomba, and Bussing, were immediately transformed from enemy assets into British naval auxiliaries, their original identities erased through the bureaucratic alchemy that concealed special operations behind mundane administrative procedures. The Duchessa d'Aosta became HMS Duchessa, serving the Royal Navy as a troop transport and communications vessel until war's end. Her spacious passenger accommodations proved ideal for carrying special operations clandestine assignments across the Atlantic and Mediterranean theatres. The irony was both poetic and practical. The ship that had sheltered Axis operations now served British covert warfare with equal effectiveness. The German cargo vessel Licomba was recommissioned as HMS Empire Yukon, her holds converted to carry the specialized equipment required for amphibious operations. Her first mission under British command involved supplying SOE operations along the French coast, a direct reversal of her original purpose as a supply vessel for German U-boat bases. The symbolic transformation was complete. German efficiency now served British audacity. Most significantly, the tugboat Bussing became HMS Empire Confidence, her powerful engines and sophisticated navigation equipment proving invaluable for maritime salvage operations throughout the world. Her German engineering, designed for efficiency and reliability, served British interests with the same mechanical precision that had originally served the Wehrmacht. The vessel that had represented German industrial capability now embodied British operational adaptability. The intelligence windfall from Operation Postmaster continued to yield strategic advantages long after the ships themselves had been integrated into Royal Navy service. The Axis naval codes captured aboard the Duchesse d'Aosta enabled British cryptographers at Bletchley Park to decrypt German and Italian merchant marine communications throughout 1942 and 1943. The information allowed Allied naval forces to intercept supply convoys, track U-boat movements, and coordinate attacks on Axis shipping with unprecedented precision. Perhaps more importantly, the operational techniques developed for Postmaster became standard procedures for SOE missions worldwide. The combination of technical expertise, diplomatic deception, and tactical audacity that characterized the Fernando Po raid was replicated in operations from Norway to Burma. The success validated Churchill's vision of irregular warfare as a force multiplier that could achieve strategic results through minimal resource investment. The psychological impact of Operation Postmaster extended far beyond its immediate tactical success. German and Italian naval personnel, already struggling with the challenges of Atlantic convoy warfare, now faced the additional burden of defending supposedly secure anchorages from British special operations. Every neutral port became a potential target, forcing Axis forces to maintain expensive defensive measures that diverted resources from offensive operations. The Spanish government's inability to prevent or protest the operation effectively demonstrated the limitations of neutrality in total war conditions. Fernando Po's strategic position made it valuable to both sides, but Spain lacked the military strength to enforce its territorial sovereignty against determined special operations. The precedent established by Postmaster would influence Spanish policy for the remainder of the war, gradually shifting from strict neutrality toward cautious cooperation with Allied interests. Major March Phillips received the Distinguished Service Order for his leadership of Operation Postmaster, but the citation's language remained deliberately vague about the specific nature of his achievement. The official record referred only to exceptional courage and leadership during special operations in West African waters. The full story would remain classified until 1962, 20 years after the events it described. The men who participated in Operation Postmaster dispersed to other assignments within weeks of their return to Freetown, their shared experience becoming another classified secret in Britain's expanding catalogue of irregular warfare. Many would not survive the war. Lieutenant Graham Hayes was captured and executed by German forces in France. Captain Geoffrey Appleyard died in a special air service operation in Sicily. Lieutenant Commander Leonard Guise was lost when his ship struck a mine in the Mediterranean, but their legacy endured in the operational doctrines and training programs that transformed British special forces from desperate improvisation into systematic capability. The techniques pioneered in Fernando Po's harbour would be refined and expanded throughout World War II, ultimately influencing the development of modern special operations forces in armies worldwide. The perfect theft had become something greater than tactical success. It had become proof that audacity, when combined with technical competence and strategic vision, could reshape the very nature of warfare itself. Operation Postmaster demonstrated that in total war, victory belonged not necessarily to the strongest forces, but to those most willing to abandon conventional thinking in pursuit of unconventional results. The harbour at Santa Isabel returned to its colonial torpor within days of the operation's completion, but the precedent established that humid January night would echo through the corridors of military planning for generations. The age of gentlemanly warfare had ended. The era of perfect thieves had begun. In the end, Operation Postmaster achieved something more profound than the capture of 3 enemy vessels or the disruption of Axis supply lines. It demonstrated that the true strength of democratic nations lay not in their adherence to conventional rules of engagement, but in their willingness to adapt those rules when survival demanded innovation. The men who sailed into Fernando Po's harbour on that humid January night in 1942 carried with them not just explosives and cutting tools, but the transformative power of audacious thinking applied to impossible problems. The operation's legacy resonated far beyond its immediate tactical success. In the classified corridors of the Pentagon and Whitehall, Operation Postmaster became a case study in the strategic application of unconventional warfare, proof that small, highly trained units could achieve results that entire divisions could not match through conventional assault. The techniques pioneered by March Phillips and his commandos would evolve into the doctrines that guided special operations forces through the Cold War and beyond. Today, the harbour at Santa Isabel, now Malabo, capital of Equatorial Guinea, shows no trace of the events that unfolded in its waters 8 decades ago. The colonial buildings that housed German and Italian officers have been replaced by modern structures, and the names on the street signs reflect African independence rather than European colonial. But in the naval archives of Britain and Germany, the records of Operation Postmaster remain as testimony to a night when audacity triumphed over arrogance, when planning overcame complacency, and when the rules of warfare were rewritten by men who understood that survival sometimes required the courage to steal. The 3 ships that disappeared from Fernando Po that night served their new masters well. The Duchessa d'Aosta transported Allied personnel and supplies until 1946, when she was sold to civilian operators and returned to peaceful passenger service. The Likomba, rechristened Empire Yukon, carried cargo across dangerous seas until war's end. Her German engineering adapted to serve British logistics with characteristic efficiency. The tugboat Bussing, transformed into Empire Confidence, rescued damaged vessels and supported amphibious operations from North Africa to Normandy, her powerful engines serving the cause of liberation rather than conquest. The men who planned and executed Operation Postmaster paid the ultimate price for their audacity. March Phillips fell in France, Hayes died in German custody, Appleyard perished in Sicily, each death a reminder that irregular warfare demanded not only tactical skill, but existential courage. They fought not for glory or recognition, but for the principle that democratic nations could not survive by playing defense against totalitarian aggression. Their sacrifice transformed Fernando Po from a footnote in colonial history into a symbol of strategic innovation under fire. The operation proved that in total war, neutrality was merely another tactical challenge to be overcome through superior planning and execution. The precedent established in Spanish Guinea would influence military thinking from the Korean War to contemporary counter-terrorism operations, a legacy measured not in monuments or medals, but in the continued freedom of nations willing to defend themselves through unconventional means. History isn't just written in the grand gestures of armies and the declarations of statesmen. It's forged in the quiet courage of individuals who understand that sometimes the most profound victories are achieved not through strength, but through audacity, so complete that it transforms weakness into weapon, uncertainty into opportunity, and impossible odds into inevitable success. The men who stole 3 ships from Fernando Po understood this truth in their bones, and their legacy endures in every special operations mission that follows their example of perfect audacity applied to imperfect circumstance. History isn't just written, it's remembered through those who still care to listen. What story should we tell next? Subscribe to keep their memory alive. Your feedback is incredibly valuable and helps me keep making better content for you.